Calories in versus calories out doesn't matter. At least that's what seems to be trendy to say in 2025. Everyone's looking for the next big angle on how to debunk CICO, and the insulin model has been pretty much torn to shreds. And so the next big thing is metabolic health. If you're metabolically healthy, you won't be fat, they say. My name is Randall James, and this is Always Adaptive. And I recently got into a friendly debate with someone over calories. Was a friend of mine, and he sent me a podcast to sort of back up some of the claims he made over the phone. Instead of listening to the podcast and then responding to my friend, I figured I'd hit two birds with one stone and dissect the podcast in a video. The podcast was by a guy named Jay Feldman over at the Energy Balance podcast. And in it, he critiques CICO and attempts to use some studies to back up his claim. This is going to be a dense video, a lot of information. So grab a snack or a coffee and let me show you the final boss of videos in defense of calories. It's often said that America's weight has gone up dramatically despite food intakes going down. I don't think Jay said this, but my friend did, and I've heard it multiple times before. I just wanted to touch on this briefly because this is a false premise and unfortunately has become the cornerstone of many movements that try and debunk the calories in versus calories out model of weight loss. They say it can't be calories because calories have gone down. As you can see from this image, calories have gone up by a large margin since the 70s. This is an Excel spreadsheet taken directly from USDA.gov. This is called the loss-adjusted food availability number, and it takes the raw food availability, which, yes, has also gone up to a whopping 3,900 calories per person a day, and then subtracts estimated loss via retail loss, which is spoilage, shrinkage, discarded at grocery stores, restaurants, etc., and then also consumer-level losses, which is like plate waste and spoiled food. This comes up with loss-adjusted food availability, or how much people are actually eating. I emphasize that raw number has gone up because in the 1970s, the raw per capita food availability was around 3,200. Once again, it's now 3,900. We're buying enough food to feed each person almost 4,000 calories per day. So all in all, calorie availability and consumption have both gone up. In conjunction with this, let's quickly discuss movement going down. Take a look at this image. This is a measure of MET hours per week. MET, M-E-T, equals metabolic equivalent of task. 1 MET equals the energy cost of sitting quietly, which is roughly around 1 kilocalorie per kilogram per hour. For example, walking would be the equivalent of 3 to 4 METs, running 8 to 10 METs, vigorous sport, 12 plus METs. And so MET hours per week would be total energy cost from physical activity summed over a week. So if you did an activity at 4 METs for 1 hour, that's 4 MET hours. If you did that 5 times in a week, 4 times 5, that's 20 MET hours a week. In this graph, the y-axis shows total weekly physical activity energy in MET hours per week, broken down by active leisure in red, travel by blue, domestic chores, light green. And you can see that total activity has declined from roughly 235 MET hours per week in 1965 to around 160 MET hours per week by 2009. And projections suggest a drop to 126 METs per hour per week by 2030. At the same time, sedentary hours, which is the black line, have climbed. Now, again, I just wanted to put that in there because people will say, well, calories have gone down and movement has gone up. People say all kinds of things. So I just had to put that in there just to take care of whatever caveat someone might come up with at a later date. Now, with that out of the way, on to the response to the podcast. I just had to get that out of the way first because people just keep regurgitating, we're not eating more, but we are. So the podcast is by Jay Feldman. Like I said, it's episode 123, Debunking the CICO Myth. Calorie deficits are not required for fat loss. That last part I do agree with. First, let me just say that he attempts to steelman CICO at the beginning of this, and it was a very oversimplified definition, and I would not say it was a steelman at all. He himself calls it an oversimplification later in the video, and if you speak to the most knowledgeable of us, we'd say things like thyroid and other hormones matter, just a lot less than people like to think. We'd also say that constrained energy balance matters to a degree. I'll get into that shortly. Calorie deficits are not required for fat burn, as evidenced by those of us who are able to recomp or build muscle and burn fat at the same time. So yeah, if you were just speaking to the average Joe Schmo on the internet, you might find a really simplified definition of calories, or perhaps a kid that's straight out of college that has no practical knowledge. But that's not me. Throughout this, I'm going to play some of the clips from his podcast and then break down some arguments. Let's start with the first one. So at 420, he starts with the caveat.
While I am going to be criticizing various aspects of calories in, calories out, this does not mean that I'm saying that the amount of food that you eat does not matter. Those are two entirely different questions. Of course, they're related ones, and we'll be kind of parsing that all out as we go.
Well, how would we measure the amounts without calories and macros? I really want you to ponder on that question for a while, specifically for athletes and bodybuilders. And we're going to revisit this a couple times throughout this episode. He then goes on to give his definition of a calorie. So I'm going to do a brief recap and add a couple points that are extremely useful for how we visualize calories. What is a calorie? What do we actually mean by a calorie? One small calorie is enough energy to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. 1 kilocalorie is 1,000 small calories. 1 kilocalorie would be the big C calorie on food labels. 1 kilocalorie is roughly equivalent to 4.184 kilojoules. This comes from physics. Joules are the official international system of units measure of energy. And in fact, many countries, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, they list energy on food labels in kilojoules, while the US sticks with kilocalories. So how are food calories measured? A small sample of food is burned in a sealed chamber. This is called a bomb calorimeter. The heat released raises water temperature and total energy is calculated. Adjustments are made for digestibility, leading to average macronutrient values of protein equals 4 kilocalories per gram, carbs is 4 kilocalories per gram, fat 9, and alcohol 7 kilocalories per gram. So when someone says food doesn't actually contain calories, a calorie is just a measure of heat, a calorie is a unit of potential energy, traditionally measured as heat. And in modern SI units, that heat is quantified in kilojoules, as I mentioned. They're technically right, but completely missing the point. Yes, a calorie is a unit. It's a measurement, not a thing. That's like saying this road doesn't contain miles. Yes, it just covers a distance that can be measured in miles. Or you could say this dumbbell doesn't contain pounds. Yes, it just has mass that can be measured in pounds. Calories describe how much chemical energy a food provides. That energy is stored in the molecular bonds of fats, carbs, proteins, and of course, alcohol. When we metabolize food, we are releasing that energy in a controlled, stepwise way, not as raw fire or heat, but as usable biochemical energy, mostly in the form of ATP. The bottom line here is that food doesn't contain heat. It contains chemical energy, and we measure that energy in calories. Calling it just a measure of heat is like saying a paycheck is just a number on paper. Technically true, but totally missing its real-world value and impact. Just for fun, to compare energy density, we're going to take a cheeseburger, which has about 300 kilocalories or 1,255 kilojoules, and we're going to put that up against gasoline, on the other hand, which has an energy density of 44,000 kilojoules, way higher. In theory, if you could combust food efficiently like gasoline, you could power a car. But engines aren't designed for food, and bodies aren't designed for gasoline. And I think that's the problem with his entire framing for calories. He mentions cars can't use cheeseburgers, and so it's not usable energy. No, the car just doesn't have the machinery to do it. I'm sure you could make a car that can use it, just like there are people that make vehicles that run off of water. So yes, you could do it. It would just be extremely inefficient. I'm bringing up gasoline because of his point here.
The Big Mac here, 217 Big Macs could have the same potential energy required, or the amount of energy required to drive a car 88 miles. Obviously, regardless of how many Big Macs you put in the fuel tank of your car, it will never work. It will never actually be usable energy for the car. And the same thing is true when we think about it in the other terms, in terms of what's going on in our bodies. So if we consume a liter of gasoline, that is the equivalent amount of energy as is in 2 pounds of body fat. But no matter how much gasoline you drink, that will never become body fat, right? Doesn't matter how many potential calorie or potential energy is in there, how many calories are in there, it's never going to become body fat. Same with grass, and grass is something that some animals do use to produce energy. Typically, it's going to be ruminant animals that consume the grass, and then it gets fermented in the intestines. Or for them, they have multiple kind of chambers, and that produces short chain fatty acids.
So listen. Not all calories measured in a bomb calorimeter count as calories available to human metabolism. Gasoline is an extreme example, totally unusable. Sure, you can throw gasoline or wood shavings into a bomb calorimeter and get heat out, but CICO was never about burning random molecules. It's about how the human body extracts, processes, and stores energy. A calorie measures heat energy, yes, but in human biology, we're not just igniting food in a fire, we're running it through complex enzymatic processes to extract usable energy in the form of ATP. Jay argues that because gasoline has calories but doesn't add tissue, calories are somehow disconnected from how the body stores energy. But that's a flawed framing. Calories only matter if they're biologically accessible, if the body can extract, process, and direct that chemical energy. So when we track dietary calories, we're not tracking abstract heat, we're tracking usable energy potential. That energy goes into mechanical work, heat generation, biosynthesis, or when intake exceeds expenditure, storage as tissue mass. Saying gasoline has calories but doesn't make you fat is like saying wood pulp has calories but doesn't feed you. True, but irrelevant. CICO was never about burning random molecules. It's about the energy the human body can actually absorb and store. That's why calories remain the fundamental unit for understanding energy balance and tissue changes. He also uses the example of 5 pounds of grass roughly equating to 2 pounds of muscle. Yes, 5 pounds of grass does contain a certain caloric value measured by bomb calorimetry. But humans lack the enzymes, like cellulase, to break down cellulose and extract those calories. That's why we can't just eat grass and bulk up like a cow. But again, this doesn't disprove CICO. CICO applies to bioavailable, metabolizable calories, not theoretical chemical energy locked inside indigestible substances. It's not that calories don't matter. It's that only accessible calories count toward the energy balance equation. And here's where this connects directly to something we already account for in nutrition. Insoluble fiber. This is a milder example from gasoline. Technically, it contains chemical energy, but we lack the enzyme to break it down and absorb it. Insoluble fiber has caloric energy on paper, but we can't digest it, so it doesn't meaningfully contribute to our usable energy pool. That's why we subtract it when calculating net carbs. Just like gasoline's chemical energy is irrelevant because we can't metabolize it. Insoluble fiber's energy is irrelevant because we can't break it down. So the gasoline example isn't evidence that calories don't matter. It's a reminder that only bioavailable calories count. And we already do this routinely in nutrition science when we distinguish between total carbs and net carbs. On to the next clip.
Whereas weight is a function of mass and gravity, and they're not equivalent. As an example, 1 pound of pure protein is just over 1,800 calories, 1 pound of pure fat is just over 4,000 calories, and a pound of pure water is 0 calories. So you could, have the exact same calories in, calories out, and then drink 1 pound worth of water, and your weight will be higher, despite the fact that that quote shouldn't be happening from the number of calories in or number of calories out.
So Jay says 1 pound of pure water is 0 calories, so you can have the exact same calories in versus calories out, and your weight will be higher due to water weight. First point, this is true, and I don't know anyone who doesn't acknowledge water weight. I think everyone acknowledges water weight. That's why it's important to do roughly the same things every day, drink about the same amount of water, weigh yourself at the same time each day, because even things like fecal matter and hydration can throw off the scale. But even with perfect routines, you can't fully control internal water shifts. Glycogen pulls in water, sodium levels fluctuate, hormones shift, and stress affects retention. So while daily consistency helps reduce noise, it's smarter to track weekly averages or trends rather than putting too much trust in any single day's reading. The second point, this is why body composition is ultimately a better metric. Most people who've been doing this for a while stop obsessing over the number on the scale and focus instead on whether fat is coming down and muscle mass is going up. I'd be curious to know if you would say in your title, Jay, that CICO is a myth for changing body composition as well. That being said, body composition changes slowly over weeks or months, while scale trends can still provide fast feedback on short-term energy balance. So the strongest approach is to combine both, use weight trends, preferably averaged, to monitor real-time shifts and pair that with periodic body comp checks for deeper insights. Just a reminder, none of this disproves calories or the energy balance model. It simply highlights the limitations we face when measuring progress with imperfect tools. As time goes on, we will develop better, more accurate, and more nuanced ways to track these changes. Because if there's one thing you can count on, technology will prevail. Next up, I want to go through Jay's citations from this episode, which can be found on his website. He cites this narrative review entitled Consequences of Weight Cycling, an Increase in Disease Risk. It's funny because critics of CICO oftentimes poo-poo on meta-analyses. At least with a meta-analysis, you can see the studies that they excluded due to whatever criteria. They pick a topic, they do the search for all those studies, and they tell you what didn't make the cut. That process doesn't exist for reviews. The author can just cherry pick whatever studies fit their narrative and then exclude the ones that don't without you knowing. This is an absolute joke. This paper is a narrative review, not a systematic review or a meta-analysis. That means there's no formal search strategy. There's no Prisma flow diagram showing how many studies were screened, rejected, or included. Prisma stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. A Prisma diagram is usually a 4-part table that you'll find in a study, in a meta-analysis, that'll basically tell you the whole process that they go through. It's their way of being transparent, which is super important. And there is no sort of like official process when you have a narrative review like this. Why does it matter? Well, we get transparent reporting of search and selection steps. We get clear documentation of why the studies were excluded if they were. And this also helps us reproduce the study, which is very important in scientific research. We need to be able to know the exact steps people went through to get whatever result it is so that we can, another scientist can come along and reproduce it. So I can't go through all of the points that he makes based on this narrative review. That would take up an entire episode. But I just wanted to talk about it real quick, just to drive home the point that people make fun of meta-analysis, but then they'll cherry pick a narrative review like this. Not that there was even anything really noteworthy from what he was talking about in that study, but anyways, the next citation from his website from this video is entitled Precision in Nutritional Information Declarations on Food Labels in Australia. He cites this paper from 2006 that shows nutrition labels can be off plus or minus 20% depending on which country you're living in. This is true and actually a really good point. However, this does not apply to minimally processed single ingredient foods. Yes, the more processed and the more complex foods are and the more ingredients there are, and if it's like a full recipe, a frozen meal or something, the calories and macronutrient profile of said food will be off. But a 4-ounce versus a 6-ounce chicken breast is going to be pretty dang accurate. So the more simple the food, the closer to accurate it will be. Either way, this doesn't make it impossible, only more difficult. And I think that's a problem that sort of plagues the people that try calories. They try it for like 2 weeks or something. They don't lose as much fat as they expected to lose. Who knows however much they expected to lose. And then they get frustrated and then they quit. I mean, even the guy that I got in an argument with, he said that he hasn't really ever, tracked his food for a really long time. And it's like, okay, well, then you haven't really ever given it a fair shot. Like he says he weighs more now and that he eats pretty much the same food now than he ate before. How do you know without tracking your food? I mean, we're all guilty of, like, if you walk by a bowl of potato chips or something, and let's say you grab a handful, well, over time, that handful is likely to get just a little bit bigger each time. Or instead of 2 licks, you take 3 licks. Instead of 4 gulps of that juice, you take 5 gulps of that juice. Or maybe the mouthful gets a little bit bigger. People track food. They don't track their licks, their bites, when they take a bite of their kids' macaroni and cheese, things of that nature. And that stuff adds up. So I think people really need to give it a fair shake and treat it as an experiment. You're not going to have perfect success the first week you track your food. Now, at 49 minutes in, he says,
graphic here, graphs basically depicting it, which is basically that on the left, we have what's called the additive model of energy expenditure. This is what most of us are told, which is that if we increase our exercise calories, let's say our normal calories out is 2,000 and we increase our exercise by 500 calories, well, then we burn 2,500 calories. And if our normal metabolic rate is 2,000 and we exercise for 1,000 calories, then we burn 3,000 calories. But that's not actually what we find. Instead, what we find is what's explained here in the constrained model of energy expenditure, which is basically that as you exercise more, not only is there behavioral compensation causing you to reduce activity, but there's also less energy used for other factors of our physiology, like maintaining the structure of, let's say, our skin or our immune function or digestion.
Now, I want to throw a caveat into this. He says not only in the form of behavior modification, but in repairing our skin, digestion, whatever. I would argue that's why the behavior changes. Your body is using resources sort of like an all hands on deck to keep vital functions going when we've exerted ourselves too much, which means less energy for physical movement. Our body wants us to rest, and so what do? We burn less calories. Notice in the graphic as well that the constrained model still has total energy expenditure up after physical activity, higher than baseline, meaning yes, compensations occur, but physical activity still plays a role in burning calories. So the citation he's pulling from for that graphic is entitled Constrained Total Energy Expenditure and Metabolic Adaptation to Physical Activity in Adult Humans. The study design was a diverse cohort of 332 adult men and women aged 25 to 45 years. They assessed total energy expenditure using the doubly labeled water method, a gold standard for measuring energy expenditure in free living individuals, and physical activity levels were quantified using accelerometry data. The relationship between physical activity and total energy expenditure was examined to determine if increased activity leads to proportional increases in energy expenditure. The findings were at low to moderate levels of physical activity, total energy expenditure increases with activity. However, beyond a certain threshold, total energy expenditure plateaus despite further increases in physical activity. This suggests that the body compensates for higher activity levels by reducing energy expenditure in other physiological processes, such as immune function or reproductive activities. The findings do support a constrained energy expenditure model where the body maintains TEE within a narrow range, adapting to increased physical activity by reallocating energy from other functions. And I think most people would agree with the constrained energy model to a degree, just not on a hormonal level, on a NEAT level, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. For example, I'm a runner. If I were to run 12 miles on Saturday, there's a very high likelihood that I would be a couch potato for the rest of the day. I would be tired. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. When we exceed our work capacity, our body will compensate. Yes. And I think a lot of the major CICO proponents would acknowledge this. But again, even according to the diagram that he showed, even with that taken into account, physical activity still contributes to total energy expenditure. But I want to point out some really severe flaws with this study. The way they captured physical activity was very poor. The study uses counts per minute per day via triaxial accelerometers. However, CPM only reflects movement magnitude, not intensity. Walking and slow jogging can produce similar CPM, but jogging has roughly 2 to 3 times the caloric cost. So if you can't tell the intensity of the activities that they're doing, there's no real way to correlate activity level with the amount of total energy expenditure. As a result, their physical activity metric cannot differentiate between low and high intensity movement, meaning calorie burn could be vastly underestimated or misclassified. This means participants with high CPM but normal TEE may have been burning fewer calories than those with lower CPM who were doing higher intensity activities that the accelerometers failed to capture. In short, the devices reflected movement volume, not metabolic intensity. So the study's link between physical activity and TEE is limited by its inability to account for energy-heavy, non-ambulatory movements like weightlifting, sprinting, or swimming, which was explicitly excluded when participants removed their devices. Lastly, this image from the study shows that there is a clear relationship between TEE and counts per minute per day, just with a huge amount of variation. And when you take into account all the things we've discussed already, that makes total sense. The top of the whiskers is trending upwards. Additionally, almost all of the candlesticks are trending upwards, and you can see the black line cut straight through the middle of the candlesticks, showing an upward trend. But anyway, CICO is still possible, but you have to account for all of these other variables. Indeed, this still does not debunk CICO. It just makes it more difficult. Constrained energy models don't break calorie balance. They just make the calories outside more complex. Calories in and calories out still fundamentally holds, but calories out isn't a rigid linear system where every extra step or rep mechanically adds extra burn. Instead, the body is dynamic. When you crank up exercise too high, it adjusts by downshifting other energy-consuming processes, NEAT, immune function, hormone production, although the latter two, I would say, are very minimal, partially offsetting the extra burn. So yes, CICO is still the framework, but understanding where and when the body compensates helps you apply it smarter, not abandon it. The next citation from the video was this study entitled, The Effects of Repeated Cycles of Weight Loss and Regain in Rats. The purpose of this study was to investigate whether repeated cycles of weight loss and regain, i.e. yo-yo dieting, increase metabolic efficiency, making future weight loss harder and weight regain easier. There were 28 male Sprague-Dawley rats, and they were divided into 3 groups. That was the normal diet. There was also the obese control, which was fed a high-fat diet throughout, and then the obese cycling, which was fed high-fat diet plus calorie restriction plus refeeding 2 cycles. The obese cycling rats were restricted to around 50% normal intake, and then refed to regain weight, repeating this twice. Food intake, weight changes, fat pad size, fat cell number, and lipoprotein lipase, LPL, activity were measured. After the second diet cycle, weight loss took twice as long as the first cycle, and weight regain happened 3 times faster than the first cycle. Food efficiency, which is the weight gain per kilocalorie, was 4 times higher in the cycled rats compared to obese controls. Both obese groups had higher fat mass and fat cell numbers than the control. So what are the claims being insinuated by this study? They're saying weight cycling leads to increased metabolic efficiency, making losing weight slower and regaining weight faster over time. But I want to point out some really major flaws of this study as well. First and foremost, it's a rodent study, so we have to take all of this with a grain of salt. The second thing is that the obese cycled rats were subjected to a massive caloric restriction, 50%, while on a high-fat diet, a setup that inherently favors a loss of protein and a storage of fat. During the second weight loss cycle, they lost a disproportionately large amount of protein, around 45% of the weight lost, far more than during the first cycle, which was around 21%. For rats, this loss of lean mass would cause a dramatic drop in resting metabolic rate, even more pronounced proportionally than in humans. This is going to make the body much more efficient and fat prone during refeeding. It's also going to affect what's that? NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Once they regained weight, the empty fat cells, the adipocytes, were primed to refill, creating a rapid and efficient fat storage process. This isn't just about regaining weight, it's about the body prioritizing fat regain over lean tissue recovery and locking in a higher fat to lean ratio after each cycle. This is a perfectly reasonable and logical thinking. So the next step for me would be to repeat this experiment with a high protein diet. Like, imagine what would happen if you just kept losing muscle. Do you think it would be easier for you to gain fat over time? Yes. The answer is yes, absolutely. So we've gone through his citations and kind of pointed out the flaws with these studies. Next up, I want to prove CICO, and to do so, we're going to discuss a couple randomized control trials. This one, entitled A Randomized Control Trial to Isolate the Effects of Fasting and Energy Restriction on Weight Loss and Metabolic Health in Lean Adults, had a sample of 36 participants aged around 30 with a BMI of around 22. So the participants were randomized into 3 groups. We have group 1, which was 75% of maintenance calories daily, or a 25% daily deficit. Group 2, which alternated between 0 calories and 150% of maintenance calories, or a 50% deficit divided over 2 days, which is 25% daily. And then group 3, which was alternating between 0 calories and 200% of maintenance calories. I've already covered this study before, but I wanted to bring this in here because these types of studies are perfect for proving calories. Now, why does this matter for CICO? The 0-200 group fasted every other day but ate twice as much on feeding days, fully balancing out calories. Guess what? No weight or fat loss. The 2 energy-restricted groups, whether daily or alternate day, both lost weight regardless of when they ate because they ran a net calorie deficit. Totally predictable. Here's another isocaloric, totally predictable fasting study entitled The Effect of Isocaloric Time-Restricted Eating on Body Weight in Adults with Obesity, a randomized control trial. Study design for this one was 41 participants. These were adults with obesity and either pre-diabetic or had type 2 diabetes. The intervention, they were randomized into 2 groups: time-restricted eating, where they consumed all calories within a 10-hour window with 80% of calories consumed before 1 p.m., and a usual eating pattern group who consumed calories over a greater than or equal to 16-hour window with greater than or equal to 50% of calories after 5 p.m. Both groups received isocaloric diets, meaning total calorie and nutrient content were matched and maintained throughout the 12-week study period. The primary outcomes that they measured were changes in body weight at 12 weeks. For the weight loss, the time-restricted eating group averaged weight loss of 2.3 kgs, and the usual eating pattern average weight loss of 2.6 kgs. Between group difference, 0.3 kgs, indicating no statistically significant difference. So once again, totally predictable. And there are so many other randomized trials that are isocaloric or isonitrogenous in humans that show no differences between diets at maintenance or in a deficit, that the participants experience totally predictable results. Look at the keto and carnivore studies, the performance studies looking at carbs versus fats effects on hypertrophy and strength. All of these studies that are isocaloric have 100% predictable results. When they put them in a deficit, they lose weight. When they put them at maintenance, they don't lose weight. All of it is predictable and predicated on controlling calories. How else could, I want you to ponder on this for a second. How else could we complete these studies without calories? Think about that. All of these studies that we have where they compare keto to carnivore or keto to vegan or Mediterranean to this and carbs versus fat and this, that, and the third. How would we be able to get, one, replicatable studies, but two, figure out which study is more beneficial for each individual thing without calories? We need calories. Calories are the best tool we have so far to measure nutrition intake. And don't even get me started on the Twinkie diet. If you're not familiar with the Twinkie diet was an informal experiment conducted in 2010 by Mark Haub. He was professor of human nutrition at Kansas State University. Over a 10-week period, Haub consumed a diet primarily consisting of convenience store snacks foods such as Twinkies, Little Debbie cakes, Doritos, Oreos, sugary cereals, whatever, while limiting his daily caloric intake to approximately 1,800 calories, down from his estimated maintenance level of 2,600 calories. Haub aimed to demonstrate that weight loss is primarily a function of caloric deficit, regardless of the nutritional quality of the food he consumed. He sought to challenge the notion that clean eating is the sole path to weight loss by focusing on the principle of energy balance. Haub lost 27 pounds over the 10-week period, reducing his body mass index from 28.8 to 24.9, transitioning from overweight to a normal weight range. His body fat percentage decreased by approximately 10%, and for his cholesterol levels, his LDL cholesterol decreased by 20%, his HDL increased, that's the good cholesterol, increased by 20%. His triglycerides also reduced by 39%. While the diet was predominantly composed of processed snacks, Haub included a daily multivitamin, a protein shake, and a small amount of vegetables such as canned green beans or celery, just to get some more essential nutrients. And there are tons of other people that do this in an unofficial way where they basically eat whatever they want as long as it fits within their calories and their macronutrient profile. They eat the ice cream if they want to have the ice cream. They eat the cookie. They eat the muffin, whatever. They have the pizza. They have the cheeseburger, and they still lose weight. They still lose fat. They still improve their blood glucose markers, whatever. So I don't understand how you can sit here and say that calories aren't a useful metric for controlling how much food we're eating. When you try to say CICO doesn't work, you're discounting millions of bodybuilders who are literally the leanest individuals on the earth and have the most muscle mass of anyone on the earth. If you wanted to be a bodybuilder and put on muscle, how are you calculating your food without calories and macros? Tell me. I'm genuinely curious. I really want you to respond to this, Jay. A good example of this is Jeff Nippard. He recently released a video where he and his brother trained as perfectly as possible for 1 year, going through a bulk and a cut to see how much muscle Jeff, as an experienced lifter, and his brother, as an inexperienced lifter, could put on. This was an absolute masterclass on how calories allow you to manipulate your body weight and composition down to the freaking decimal point. I strongly urge anyone that still resists the notion of calories to go and watch that. It's entitled, How Much Muscle Did I Gain in 365 Days? I'll put the link in the description. But some last points I want to make, just some rapid fire quotes of his. Quote, CICO does not lend any support for eating less and exercising more, unquote. Once again, what about the millions of bodybuilders that manipulate their body composition every single year using CICO and if it fits your macro style approaches? You're discounting. I mean, literally, it's millions. There are people like myself, like I'm pretty lean. I've put a lot of muscle on my frame. And it's always funny to me, too, because the people that use CICO or use if it fits your macro approaches, these are the people that have the best results when it comes to body composition or their physiques. Like, these are people that have world-class physiques. So it's funny, like, compare the people that just focus on insulin or just focus on metabolic health, whatever that means, and then compare them to people that use CICO approaches, if it fits your macros approaches, and you tell me who has had the best success in manipulating their body composition. Another quote of his, just real quick, is CICO is also not predictive. No way to know ahead of time. False. I predicted my client Lori would lose weight. She's lost 12 pounds in 9 weeks or so. Maybe not precisely, but roughly, yes. Use the words can't predict anything. That was something. And then again, I go back to the studies that I cited earlier, and the probably at this point thousands of studies that look at comparing different diets and different outcomes, body composition, performance, whatever. These are all predictive. When they're in a maintenance, they don't lose weight. Comparing two different diets. When they're in a deficit, they lose weight. Totally predictive. Another quote, CICO cannot determine what mass is lost and gained, unquote. Correct. Macros do. Who have you been talking to, Jay? I don't think I've met anyone that is thinking that it's just calories that determine whether you're putting on fat or whether you're putting on muscle or whether you're losing fat or whether you're losing muscle. Intensity matters. The macronutrient profile matters. There's a lot that goes into it. So I think, again, your attempt to steel man the CICO model was really not a steel man at all, and it was super oversimplified. Another quote, CICO is generally reduced to completely inaccurate oversimplifications, unquote. I agree. This goes for any field, though, and is exactly the mistake you made in the beginning of this video with your attempt to steel man. Lastly, there's one big point that I need to touch on, because this, again, is another thing that people will bring up about the whole hormone point. I want to talk about thyroid hormones. It's often said that people with hypothyroidism have dramatically lower metabolic rates. I think this is overstated, and the differences are much smaller. I spent a really long time with two different AIs trying to find studies that can prove the commonly cited number of 10 to 40%. The AIs continued to spout off that number, the 10 to 40% number, but when I asked for proof, they made up studies and basically just broke at the end there. So I was left to my own devices. But I did find some studies to take a look at. This study, entitled Subclinical Hypothyroidism, Weight Change, and Body Composition in the Elderly, the Cardiovascular Health Study, it didn't measure total energy expenditure or resting energy expenditure directly, but it did look at weight change and body composition. There were no differences between hypothyroid and euthyroid, that would be people with normal thyroid function, groups. You would not expect to find that if they had these dramatic differences. And then also this study, entitled Thyroid Function Variation in the Normal Range, Energy Expenditure, and Body Composition in LT4 treated subjects. They did measure resting energy expenditure via indirect calorimetry. They also measured total energy expenditure via doubly labeled water, the thermic effect of food via post-meal calorimetry, and macronutrient oxidation via gas exchange and urinary nitrogen. They also measured body composition via DEXA scan and physical activity via accelerometer. The results were a small resting energy expenditure difference, even with low T3. The measured REE difference was roughly 10 kilocalories per day per 10 picograms per deciliter of FT3. Even if someone has 100 picogram per deciliter lower FT3, that's a really big gap. That's only roughly 100 kilocalories a day lower. Barely 5 to 7% of daily expenditure for most people. This is nowhere near the dramatic 10 to 40% metabolic slowdowns people often claim. TSH levels also didn't predict resting energy expenditure differences, REE. The study showed no REE differences between low normal and high normal TSH groups. This directly undermines the belief that simply having a higher TSH or borderline hypothyroid status tanks metabolism. Higher T3 did not equal leaner, and lower T3 did not equal fatter. Surprisingly, higher FT3 was associated with higher BMI and fat mass. So even though REE slightly rises, the body's overall energy balance seems to override the small metabolic differences. The best evidence we have, and there's not that much, so I don't know how people are saying so confidently that hypothyroidism makes you burn so many less calories, but the best evidence we have shows that with normal to low thyroid ranges, the drop in daily energy expenditure is tiny, on the order of 100 calories per day, not the massive metabolic suppression people fear. The body compensates, and weight changes are far more about intake and storage regulation than just thyroid-driven burn. Now, you could say some of this is in subclinical hypothyroid patients, but only 0.3 to 0.5 of the population have overt or clinical hypothyroidism. 4 to 10% of the population have subclinical hypothyroidism. The vast majority of people are subclinical. this has become almost like a trendy cop-out where everyone's so quick to say, oh, I have hypothyroidism. And a lot of people haven't even been formally diagnosed. So I think these studies are perfectly relevant. Anyways, if you know of a study that directly compares energy expenditure between people with hypothyroidism and euthyroidism in humans, please, for the love of all that is holy, send it to me, because I think it doesn't exist. And what we do have shows very small changes. And I think people are really just largely talking out of their ass when they cite hypothyroidism for the way that people burn fewer calories. So my closing thoughts are this. I have great empathy for people who try to measure their calories and find it doesn't work for them. There's a saying, the best diet is the diet you'll follow. And if using intermittent fasting or keto or low fat or any other approach is what helps you stay consistent and lose weight, I fully support you in that endeavor. However, let's not pretend it has nothing to do with calories. It's not magic. It's not bypassing thermodynamics. It's just finding a strategy that helps you naturally create and sustain a calorie deficit. I respect every method that helps someone succeed, but we owe it to ourselves to be realistic about what's actually driving the results. But that's it for me. Sheesh, what a doozy. This is, if you made it all the way to the end of this, I really do appreciate you sticking around. I know this was a super dense video, a lot to take in, but hopefully you learned a lot from it. If you did, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Once again, my name is Randall James, and this is Always Adaptive, a business born from the idea that you are always adapting. Literally right this very second, whether you are sitting or standing, that is an input into your body that your body is adapting to. Me right now, I'm standing. My nervous system is adapting to standing. So control your inputs and you can control your life. I'll see you at the next one. Stay adaptive.